Um, this is our first of 4 book reviews, which we'll have this year. Tonight, we will review the book called Land Matters, South Africa's Failed Land Reforms and the Road Ahead by advocate Tembeka Ngcukaito. This book gives a contextual and historical analysis of the land issue in the South African context. It's definitely anchored in history and goes on to unpack the effects of various legislation such as the Native Land Acts, Bantu stance, and of course the forced removals. Advocate Tembeka speaks to us in terms of several themes, which include the importance of ancestral land, the land restitution program, the issue of poverty transfer across various generations, communal land ownership, and the elite capture of the land reform program. And of course, he also goes on to cover the patriarchal systems, which you find in land restitution. This book gives us a clear and comprehensive analysis of the different ANC policies on land over the years. This is during negotiations and even in the post-apartheid era in terms of the stance that the ANC actually holds regarding land. The book uncovers issues of the government's achievement and failures in land distribution, restitution, of course, the land reform. Our panel is made up of a number of thought leaders who definitely shape the discourse in different parts of society. As I'd indicated earlier, that we have the author of the book, Advocate Tembeka, who is also an advocate of the High Court. We also have Nolundi Luaya, who is the Director of Land and Accountability at the Director of the Land and Accountability Research Center, sorry. We have Wandile Sihlobo, who is a Chief Economist of the Agricultural Business Chamber of South Africa. So let's get into it. I'd like to please invite our esteemed guest, Advocate Tembeka, who will take us through the process of writing the book, what inspired him, and of course the different encounters that he went through while writing the book. And most importantly, we'd like to get a feel of what the advocate hopes the reader will take away from the book. So Advocate Tembeka, over to you.
Thank you. I've written down what I wanted to say because a couple of days ago, I launched the same book at the Tshwane University of Technology. And the following day, my face was on the front page of the Times Live online with a lot of things I supposedly said, some of which I didn't quite recognize. So I learned my lessons there that write down what you want to say if you don't want to be misquoted. Nevertheless, I must thank you for the invitation, and I want to greet my discussants, Nolundi, Nomdagwethu Wandile. And also just to thank the School of Governance for setting this up. I mean, in many respects, inspiration to write a book about land seems obvious, but sometimes some explanation might be necessary. This is my second book, which touches upon the problem of land. What I am trying to do, and it's not yet done, but it's an ongoing project, is to instill a meaningful conversation about land in which we can debate from various perspectives, from the perspective of history, from the perspective of law, and from the perspective of politics, the 3 elements which intersect in the book about land. Hopefully that way we can have constructive discussions. Most of the things I write are obviously anchored in ANC traditions and in ANC histories. That is all deliberate. My first book is entirely about the founding generation of the ANC and what the founders hoped to achieve and how they hoped to use the knowledge and the skills to advance African people. This book also follows that trajectory about what the thinking and the policy evolution of the ANC has been. The spine of the book, which is what I want to talk about now, the spine of the book is on the period between 1994 and the time of the publication of the book, which is 2021. And I am trying there to unpack on a systematic basis what the constraints to land reform have been and what the possible solutions might be or might look like. But all of those are all suggestive and indicative and intended to generate more conversation. So if you don't mind, then if I could read what I have prepared just to anchor the discussion. I look forward to what Nolundi and Wandile have to say. 5 years ago, I asked then Minister of Land Affairs and Rural Development how much the ANC government had spent on the restitution of land since 1994. The amount then was 60 billion, she informed me. I then asked how much of that had gone to landowners, being a small commercial agricultural elite. The answer was that the majority of it, more than 60%, had been paid to landowners. With a unique vantage point to consider exactly where we stand on land. In that year, when the ANC came to power, 82 million hectares of commercial farmland, that is 86% of all farmland, was in the hands of a white minority, 10.9% of the population. But there was greater concentration too. There were only 60,000 farmers who held 86% of all commercial farmland. Over 13 million Black people, the majority of whom poverty-stricken, were crowded in the homelands with very tenuous rights to the land. The ANC's primary promise was to end this land injustice. Some 23 years later, in 2017, the government's land audit showed that whites own 72% of the total hectares owned by individual landowners. Colored people own 15%, Indians 5%, Africans 4%, and the other undescribed at 3%. And the co-owners stood at 1%. This was not only a problem of race, it was also a problem of gender. The gender figures were equally depressing. Individual males owned 72%, females 13%, male and female 11%, and other 3%. So if one takes into account the picture in 1994 versus 2017, the difference is only a meager 13%. Yet the amounts of money that have been spent are sizable. And it is not as if the Constitution is restrictive either. To start with, Section 25 of the Constitution is one of the most ambitiously transformative property clauses in the world. Its four main features: expropriation of land, subject to payment of just and equitable compensation, acquisition and distribution of land on an equitable basis, the right to land restitution for those who qualify, and the right to security of tenure, not only create a framework for land redress, but impose a positive legal duty on the state to address the chronic land injustice left by colonialism and apartheid. And we have an equally radical piece of legislation in the Restitution of Land Rights Act. Its provisions are indeed an envy to many countries. Why then is the government spending so much money but achieving so little? Much has been written about inefficient institutions, embedded corruption, and elite capture. Yet the structure of land reform has received very little attention. So tonight I want to reflect on the four main features in the structure of land reform to examine whether the structure is compatible with an accelerated land reform program, which undoubtedly has now become urgent. A key part to that structure was the choice of the program for land reform. The goal was to reach a wider distribution of land to a number of Blacks large enough to disrupt the white elite concentration, but to ensure continued productivity in the land. Here, the first structural error was committed. Land restitution became the central pivotal point. Yet by its very nature, the program had no prospect of addressing wider land shortages. The program was designed to meet a specific historical problem of forced removals after 1913, when the Natives Land Act became law. Its potential beneficiaries, in other words, the victims of forced removals, were only 5 million. Yet the country's land infrastructure, legal and financial resources have been devoted to it. Apart from its limited reach, the management of this program has been depressingly poor. A sobering assessment by former President Kgalema Motlante's land panel in 2019 is worth reflecting upon. He said that if the program continues with its current trajectory, it will take up to 35 years to finalize all old order claims, another 143 years to settle new order claims, and if land claims are reopened, up to 709 years to complete land restitution. And that is why leading thinkers in land matters have questioned pertinently whether or not it is time to jettison the land restitution program in its entirety. The second element in the land reform packages has been attempts at redistribution of land. If any program has exposed the structural weaknesses in the land reform architecture, it has been redistribution. And the problem hasn't been its potential scope, but its design. Unlike the claimant-driven program of restitution, land redistribution is driven by landowners. They decide which land is sold, whether by direct negotiation, advertised sales, or auction. They decide the conditions of the sale. This means that they set the price for the sale. If the buyer does not like the transaction, they must leave the land. They also decide who buys the land. They are not compelled to sell the state to the state. In this way, the entire redistribution of land value chain is dominated by landowners. Historically, they have tended to act in their own interests, not the interests of the state, nor in the interests of the beneficiaries of land reform. The problem, of course, is that there is a flaw in the design. The land acquisition process is driven by the market. The market is controlled by a few land-owning agricultural owners, land agricultural owners. A third area in the structural framework is that we have tended to neglect rural communities and their rights to the land. In 1996, the Interim Protection of Informal Land Rights Act was promulgated. The purpose was that it would apply during the period of the transition from apartheid to the democratic order. Yet its terms are especially important. First, there is a definition of an informal right to the land. This is extensive and includes use or occupation or access to tribal, customary, or indigenous laws. Second, the Act contains the notion of beneficial occupation, which is any occupation of land by a person as if they were the owner, without force, openly, and without the permission of the registered owner. Third and finally, that Act protects against the deprivation of rights, which can happen in accordance with custom and usage in that community. IPILRA's protections are potentially ambitious in its scope, yet the tenure of people living on communal land has remained precarious, and it is under pressure from various quarters, including traditional authorities, mining houses, and other big business interests. Chiefs appear to have partnered up with the ANC. Their primary goal has been to erase the entitlement of communities to the land. Consider, for instance, the recent claims that land should be registered in a single title deed in the name of a chief. And mining houses as well have been interested in the elimination of rights of ordinary people to the land. So communal areas are challenged by the state itself, not protected from the invasion of rights by chiefs, nor are they protected from the control of the land by business interests. Let me return to where I started. Why have we paid so much? The state does not decide the price for the land. Landowners do. They do so by reference to what a willing buyer would have been prepared to pay for that land in the open market. This is not done by actual sellers and actual buyers. This is done by an industry of valuers, lawyers, property agents. They all crunch the numbers. And the willing seller, willing buyer system has become part and parcel of the fabric of the land sales in the country. It is also inscribed in legislation such as the Expropriation Act. It has also been endorsed by the government through its policy paper on land published in 1997. The courts have also privileged this idea, describing it as readily quantifiable and most practical. So the answer to why we have paid so much then stares us in the face, because we have a system where the price of the land is decided not by the state, but by the owners of the land. Finally, and this is the last structural area, where the system collapses is not in the structure, but with the people. We have lost talent. When Mike Mlengana, the most senior official at the Department of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development, resigned from his position in 2020. His reasons for resigning included ongoing large-scale and widespread inefficiencies at all levels within the Agriculture Department, and what he referred to as the absolute lack of delivery knowledge and work ethic at all levels within the Agriculture Department. This view, Mr. Mlengana's view, was neither new nor surprising. In 2013 already, Professor Ben Cousins had cited the inability of land reform officials to engage in planning to support the productive use of transferred land, or to critically assess the plans drawn up for beneficiaries by consultants, as two of the key reasons for the overall failure in land reform. It is thus not credible to believe that the same officials will be able to undertake the varied and technically complex tasks required of them by the policies. And this is why I often feel there is a sense of exasperation among officials in government. The sense that the job is too big, that the job is thankless, sometimes even dangerous. Market-based solutions driven by a land-owning elite are in these settings very seductive, yet they tend to entrench rather than end structural injustice. Only deliberate interventions in favor of the poor, grounded in the rule of law, will ensure that we have a land reform program that fulfills its potential to help address poverty and inequality. To achieve land justice, we need land redistribution. This is the future of land reform, not restitution, but redistribution. Not historical claims, but present needs. And this is a program that should be giving people based on their needs land, ensuring that the prices for land are affordable, providing financial and material support for small-scale farmers, and ultimately breaking down the high levels of concentration of land in the hands of an agricultural elite. For this to happen, however, we need a capable state guided by a commitment to ending land injustice. In times like this, short-term solutions are not the answer, no matter how tempting. What we need is a moment of reflection, reflecting both on the urgency and significance of the undertaking at hand. That means lifting our gaze a little bit, looking at the horizon, dreaming again about the possibility of freedom, and again, paying homage to the promise in the Constitution to end the injustices of the past. In short, we need courage. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Advocate. That was a very informative account of your book. I did wish that you would have delved into what inspired you writing the book and the different encounters that you came across while writing, but I think we'll leave that for the Q&A session. What one takes away from your contribution now is that in order for land reform to be successful, we need to take into cognizance that it currently is largely driven by formal institutions. And these formal democratic institutions, for example, be the Land Claims Acts or the Land Claims Commission or the department in itself, need to be fully functional. And there needs to be a synergy between all of these institutions in order to ensure that we actually achieve land reform. I am grateful that you gave us that contextual and historical account of why the issue of redistribution, redistribution will be more effective than any other formula. I think what I'll do now is hand over to the book reviewers. We'll start with Nolundi Luaya, like I said, who is the Director of Land and Accountability at the Research Center. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation to join this evening's event. Please forgive my voice. I'm just recovering from a cold. I'm actually particularly pleased to be able to be part of this conversation. I had the pleasure of being in conversation with Advocate Ngcukaito with regards to his first book, and so it is perhaps coming somewhat full circle to be able to be in conversation on his second book. Program Director, what I'm going to do is just give some brief comments and reflections on some of the things that I would like to pull out on the book. I've grouped them around sort of three themes, and really they're just some brief general remarks. And then I have one or two questions which, with your permission, I'd like to put for consideration by Advocate Ngcukaito. So to begin with, I think the thing that I would like to start with and the kind of first of my 3 points is to pull out and frame what I think the book does really well, and what I think the book does that is really important for this conversation around land reform. And so the first of these is that in this book, Advocate Ngcukaito does a really marvelous job of centralizing the deep harm of dispossession. He spends part one of the book really engaging in what I think is an incredibly rich conversation about the history and the harm of the multiple acts and points at which Black people, at which African people were dispossessed of their land. There is an incredibly great and well-crafted narrative that pulls out the deliberate actions that were taken, the seen and the unforeseen consequences of those actions. And these are woven together to really build a very multi-dimensional picture of dispossession. And I think it's really important that he's worked so hard to make sure that the picture that's put forward and the engagement that the book has with this issue of dispossession is multidimensional. And so the discussion in the book really looks at dispossession from the perspective of the crime of apartheid and what that means, both in that moment, but also what it means for current conversations and thinking about reparations, restoration, and compensation, the role of capital, the role of race, and a really interesting look at some of the pseudoscience that was used to justify particular concepts of race. The discussion also looks at the loss of cattle and the distortions of customary laws, all of which I think are intricate components of what is ultimately the kind of summative narrative of the process of dispossession that Africans were subjected to, and ultimately is part of what underpins the thing towards which land reform is trying to respond. And so even though this lens of engagement around dispossession is grounded in the idea of the loss of the land, the discussion still manages to be really expansive. And as I say, I think that that's really important to commend, because there is incredible value in making sure that you take the reader through developing a deep understanding of what it is that one is seeking to address through the land reform program. And so the work that is put into crafting that expansive and multidimensional narrative is something that I really think should be commended. Of course, for a book that's trying to contribute to the conversation around land reform, it is perhaps trite to say that it should start by looking at the wound. And I think that the manner in which that analysis of the original wound, if you will, the way in which that analysis is crafted in the book is very direct, very frank, but also, as I say, really nuanced, because it draws on these multiple layers of dispossession, understands that it wasn't just one moment, one act, but rather multiple layered actions, processes that resulted in this ultimate loss. I think that this kind of centralizing of the harm of dispossession is also very powerful for our present context. In the work that we do at our research center, one often encounters deep feelings of betrayal amongst people who live in communities. In our work, we work predominantly with rural communities. And frequently there is this element, this sense that when it comes to the questions of land, when it comes to the issues of land reform, communities do feel like they have been betrayed, like promises that were made haven't been honored, and ultimately that the very sort of dream that was sold hasn't been fulfilled. And so I think to centralize the harm of dispossession in a book like this from the onset is a powerful acknowledgement for me of why it then is that people feel so profoundly and so deeply betrayed that there hasn't been progress in the land reform process. And so, in my experience, trying to capture the dispossession experience is not something that is easy. And so it really is commendable how well the book balances between being, expansive and capturing the variety of experience. It moves with quite a swiftness and an elegance from, discussing the network of ever-changing land-related laws and regulations that would have applied in British territories as different from those that might have applied in the Boer Republic. It covers the expanse of the sheer devastation of the forced removals, and then brings us right up to these questions about whether there were missed opportunities in the process of the TRC to address some of this wound, right? To address some of the harm that has been done through dispossession. And so the opening chapters of this book really, in my mind, present a very useful and powerful teaching tool. And I think that we should endeavor to use it as such. I come then to the second point that I'd like to make, and the second thing that I think the book does really well, and a piece of work or a contribution that I think is incredibly important. And so the second point is sort of loosely grouped around the theme that I'm calling thinking of compensation as a broader church. And so in my view, under this theme sits what I think is some really important work, which is the work of busting myths, right? It's the work of pulling back the curtain on some of the concepts and the terms and the ways of thinking that kind of take on a bit of a mystique, right? So if this was a magic show, or if it was a performance of illusions and lights, this is the point at which Tembeka reveals the trick, right? This is the point at which he shows the sleight of hand. And I really think that, for me, what was so powerful was that the work of myth busting sort of spreads itself across parts 2, 3, and 4 of the book, where the mysteries, the myths are revealed for what they are. And some of those myths for me are around the neutrality of this idea of property as a concept, so this kind of ability to make it clear that property was used to, disenfranchise certain people, to strip them of civil and political rights, that it isn't actually a concept that has somehow come to us from on high as a neutral, untainted concept, but rather that it carries carries with it a legacy, a baggage, and also a political utility, which I think is important to understand. You know, amongst some of the other myths that are busted, some of the other myths that are revealed are, of course, myths around what the Constitution requires, right? What it permits, what it doesn't permit. And so a really kind of detailed, rich discussion there around exactly what it is that the Constitution envisages when it thinks about compensation. A deep look at these ideas of just and equitable, and starting to just sort of pierce through some of the noise and some of perhaps the popular rhetoric to really hit at the heart of some of these key concepts that often either get thrown around as kind of a means of obfuscating the conversation, or as, you know, a means of defending certain models that perhaps are outdated. And so the myth busting is, you know, also done through this really hard, real look at the state of land reform. And it's part of what he spoke to in his opening comments. You know, a look at the statistics, the numbers, the policy positions that have locked us into unsustainable models, a really methodical pulling back of the curtain around each of these particular elements. And I think, in again, a conversation that can sometimes get so caught up in quick-fire political rhetoric that can sometimes get swallowed, you know, through populist languaging. This myth-busting work that the book does is vital work because it seeks to enrich the conversation and to actually make sure that we're having a conversation that is more meaningful as opposed to a conversation that is more noisy. And so in kind of doing this work of myth busting under this broad theme that I'm terming of thinking of compensation as a broader church, the review of land reform isn't happening in isolation. And I really enjoyed the fact that this was crafted this way. But rather this review, this critical review of the state of land reform from that period, 1994, to the point of publication, continues to happen in conversation with the deep harm of dispossession, right? There continues to be a relationship that's created between the state of affairs now and why that state of affairs is not an adequate response and has not been an adequate response to the dispossession that happened historically. And so it's not an analysis that removes itself from the purpose of land reform, but rather it's one that's in constant conversation with that original harm. It's a conversation that is constantly in conversation with that original wound. And you see this come through at key points in the course of part 3. For example, the discussion of structural violence, which Tembeka knits into the discussion on land redistribution. And for me, again, that is incredibly vital, that this review of land reform isn't just a dry analytical look, but rather it's one that's putting it in conversation with the history of harm. And so this nuanced analysis underpins the discussion of a broader conception of compensation, right? Of thinking and understanding compensation in a manner that's steeped in these ideas of justice and of equity. And I really think that this robust myth busting that the book engages in throws the doors open for us to think about compensation as a broader church, really opens up a scope and a slate to now start engaging in the work of unpacking exactly how and why we think about compensation. And so it brings me to my third and final theme and sort of point that I think the book contributes, which is so important. And that is this idea that land reform is not a destination. Throughout the book, it really felt quite clear to me that Tembeka isn't concerned with, the central focus of a future point at which land reform is, quote unquote, achieved, right? This is not about fixating on there, because part of the conversation is about recognizing that we're not even sure how we get there, right? Where are we actually even going? How are we even getting there? And so what the book does is it concerns itself, to my mind, it concerns itself with the journey itself, right? The concern of this book is, what is the course that we're plotting? Why are we taking that particular route over another route? What are the means? What are the methods that we're going to use to move us from point A to point B along this journey? And, what are the means of propulsion? How are we going to accelerate? How are we going to decelerate? And really considering whether or not the tools that we've been using to this point and the tools that we might use in the future, whether those are actually fit for purpose. And if they aren't fit for purpose, how do we reinvent them, replace them, repair them, reconsider them, so that we are taking the journey with the appropriate tools, with what we need? And I think that that's really vital, because of course, one can, again, easily get kind of locked into a situation of despair, right? We have been attempting to get this right for the past, more than 25 years or so, and we're sitting at a point where it feels like things are perhaps stagnant. And I think that by focusing on the journey itself, rather than considering land reform as being about some elusive destination, there's an incredible kind of value there, because it, for me, makes it possible to conceive of how we unstuck where we're at. And I think that's a really important contribution that the book makes to thinking about land reform. And so I think there's a real acknowledgement that the road ahead is long, but like any committed traveler, Tembeka is concerned with the journey and is calling on those who are, actors in the space, those who are concerned with and care about land reform, to prepare and to focus as well on that journey, rather than to, continue kind of selling people promises of a destination we're not even sure we know how to reach. And so as I draw to a close, I think, I just want to say that the book is clearly, for me, a relevant and necessary contribution to what is a vital conversation. There can be no doubt that the land question, the question of land reform in South Africa is beyond ripe for the picking. And so a contribution like this, I think, that is so robustly and assertively pushing past some of the more kind of noisy, distracting points of conversation and calling on us to look more closely in order to find solutions is, I think, a vital contribution. And the book really steeps itself in the serious work of both identifying the problem, but also thinking about how to solve that problem and reaching for creativity, but also reaching for compassion and commitment, which for me circles back to that opening starting point of really kind of making sure that one understands deeply the harm of dispossession as being at the center of what it is that the book is trying to address. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nolundi. That was definitely an informed analysis of the book. I do echo a number of sentiments that you've shared, that when one reads the book, one is forced to have a more multidimensional approach to the issue of territorial loss. So the book forces you to look beyond territorial loss and just also to look at other aspects of what this loss meant and the implications. And secondly, it definitely highlights how the law can be so disempowering and can be used as a tool, as an instrument, or rather had been used in the historical past in order for us to find ourselves in the current social arrangements that we are in right now. I would like to then hand over to our next book reviewer, which is Wandile Slobo, who I did indicate is the chief economist of the Agricultural Business Chamber of South Africa. Over to you.
Thank you so very much, Madam Chair, and good evening to all the colleagues that are joining us online here on Zoom and also in other platforms. Let me start also by just congratulating Umdagwetu for putting out this important work. I think if there are folks on the line online that haven't read the copy, they should try and get one. And then also in making up my remarks onto this, I will be speaking over some of the points that Nolundi has also spoken to, and just to reflect about what I enjoyed the most on this book, and also what do I take out of it. And I think to kick things off, for me, where I agree most with the book is that it's been now nearly 3 decades, but if one looks at the land reform story in South Africa, it's really not possible in any definitive way to figure out if land reform has benefited fully the South African economy or society. You go for every urban community in South Africa or every peri-urban settlement or communities, all you find is some sorts of examples of a failed land reform project. So in that sense, for me, I think we have a deeper problem, and which is why even on the cover of this book, it talks about the failed land reform project in South Africa. I think it mirrors those frustrations. But what I think is important as we embark again on this conversation is, of course, to have an honest assessment of where are we, what are the challenges, and then how do we go forward from where we're sitting at. Like that, even the audience, we have a couple of people, the audience is big because we have to have honest conversation about this story of land. It tends to be emotive, politically fraught of subject, and it comes off mostly whenever we're nearing the elections. That's where we tend to be speaking a lot about land reform in South Africa. And then you go for a period of about 3 years or so where things are relatively quiet. But I think we need to be serious and not only putting on along those spaces. And I think the book begins then to bring that conversation in South Africa into the mainstream a lot more. And of course, we have been discussing the land reform and having a heated debate, I would say specifically after the 2017 conference of the ANC, where the whole thing about expropriation without compensation really came into the headlines. And that's the other themes that are contained in the book. So I think since then, we've began to be having a more heated conversation onto this story, onto this matter. And I think as we head towards the December conference, again, of the ANC, if I understand correctly, we are yet to have, again, another circle of land reform debates. Some of you already saw probably over the weekend on the Sunday Times that there was already some stories about how to think about the land reform going forward. So I think it's an opportune time that we are discussing this matter at this point. And of course, there are many opinions about how land reform has panned out in South Africa and how it's been going for nearly over the past 3 decades. But I think the one thing that we can all agree on, regardless if you are on which side of the debate onto this thing, is that the current patterns of land reform and the inequalities that we see on a land reform ownership, they are at the heart of some of the social issues that we do face. We cannot go forward with this current structure. So we need to go forward and get on with the land reform in the country. And of course, there's a lot of things that have been talked about and dealt on, and many scholars have said many things on these topics, specifically since 2017. But I think what Advocate Ngcukaito does best onto this is, again, taking all of that history, as Sisnolundi was saying, from 1994 up until to today, and putting all of that together in this brilliant book. That gives us a sense of where we are and what are some of the things that need to be done. And then I'm going to comment about how I see all of those things, and in line with almost the format that Sisnolundi has penned out, which is how the book is structured, because the book begins with the deep analysis on the dispossession. That's the first part of the book, and it follows up with the property and liberation. Straight after that, you read a lot about how the restitution, redistribution, and tenure and land tenure issues have been, and you end off with the future of compensation, which I think it's still important if there are still some debates that we are having in the country about the expropriation without compensation. And I think on the dispossession side, what the book does, and this is a point that Sisnolundi was making, is that it goes deeper into some archival history and look back into around about 1600s and to say what really happened since from that period up until, of course, the dawn of democracy. And I think this is an important history and the contribution of the book, especially in a country like ours, where we typically get told that, you need to put land reform aside and forget that and get on with life and do other things. We cannot continue to talk about land reform and the other things of the past. And I think this book brings into evidence on why such conversations are important, what was lost in the history, what really went down, and why the country can't go forward together if we are not addressing some of these injustices that actually happened in the past. And I think that's one of the important contribution that Advocate makes into this. And the other point that I liked in the Advocate's book is also the fact that we tend to agriculturalize or keep it in the rural areas, the whole point of land reform, where we see farmers and then we see land reform. But we speak less about the role of business into the land reform space, because it was not just the farmers that were involved or partially benefiting from the past injustices, but I think the business community that was at that time active, they have a role also to play as we go forward. And I think the advocate brings that point quite clearly. And he does this by looking back into what other scholars have said about this. And he invokes here one of the late great economists in South Africa, Mpho Teleblanche, who was with the University of Stellenbosch. And if you read back into history in South Africa, he was one of the first in the economics discipline who was talking about some of the reparations that needed to be made. And I think that's one of the important things that you bring in here. But advocate, one of the stuff, and I think you can perhaps maybe reflect this in the discussion. You may recall that in the expert panel about land reform and agriculture in 2018, there were all of this idea about the Land Reform Fund, which I think such things as the contribution of business as we go forward could contribute on. I would have liked you to speak a little bit about the Land Reform Fund on this book, and to say the business community contributing into land reform, what can they potentially do there? Or maybe there are some reasons why you didn't speak onto that, but that's one of the points that maybe is for the discussion. The other important point, which I think Sisnolundi highlighted nicely, is this point about the fact that Black people in South Africa did not only lose the land per se, as we speak about land reform, but there's a lot of theft and killings of livestock. And I think over the past couple of years, we've been hearing this and getting it on a bits by bits from different texts. What the advocate did in the book, he went deeper and really did some of the solid research on putting it together in a more thematic way, about to say what really happened in all of these events that led to the livestock killings. And I think this is one of the important things then, because it speaks to what was lost, because it was many people lost more than just the land. And I want to read one of the lines where I think the advocate captures this nicely in his book. He writes, I quote, "The story of land dispossession will never be complete without the understanding of the loss of indigenous people's cattle. Cattle, more than land, were a visible sign of wealth," end quote. And I think this is an important point in here, especially when we think about the contribution of business as we rebuild the country and go forward. So I think that was one of the key contribution that you have made there, advocate. And in a third part of the book, which is one of the sections also that I appreciated a lot. And I think it touches to some of the statistics that you have put out now as you were opening, putting out your opening remarks, where you speak about what's really the problem behind the slow progress of land reform, and where are we on land reform. And I mean, we see a lot of numbers onto this, where you were just quoting now, for example, saying, when you spoke with the minister and Mike Mlengana in 2013, some of the statistics that they were putting up, they were saying about 79% of South Africa's land is still in private hands, which is mainly white farmers. And I think this is an important stuff that you are bringing out, because these statistics tends to invoke a lot of emotion when one puts it out and look at the population of the country and look at how much the land ownership patterns are. But I think this is also one of the points that is South Africa's weakness, because we actually do not have correct land statistics in South Africa of what's going on. On the numbers that you cited, for example, in some of the work that I went on to do with my colleagues at Stellenbosch University, what we figured out over time was to say, looking back at 1994 and going up until around about 2019, if you may recall the 30% target that in the book you cite nicely in here, that was set by the ANC in 1994 to say in 3 years they would have distributed about 30% of the agricultural land, which at the time was about just over 80 million hectares. When we look at that data right now, today, the government has been able to move to about 20% of that target. But of course, the benefits of all of that progress are not being felt. because in one part, the state, in much of the land that they have bought is still sitting in their hands. And one can even go as far as say there is a sense of land hoarding that is happening within the government, even as far as the transfer then of all of the land that they've acquired to some of the Black beneficiaries. So the bottom point in here is not also to put a blame on the Advocate's Book, but to make a point that we do need better land databases in South Africa of what's going on, because some of the policy implication that we end up making based on this, are based on the statistics that is not as accurate. And I think that's one of the key things that as we move forward with the discussion, we will have to look at. And I think as we approach the elective conference of the ANC sometime this year, as I was referring to the Sunday Times article, that it brings back the land reform on the agenda again. I think there's going to be a lot of commentary and a lot of writing that would be happening. And some of these writings are usually based more on the emotive stuff than really on the evidence, which is why I think this book comes at the right time, and it will really be one of the beneficial things if many people can read. Not only the ANC friends that are on the call, but I think many people in South Africa I would recommend and say Land Matters is crucial work that should be read by all South Africans that care about the history of this book. And as a closing point, Chair, that I would make here is to say one thing that I found missing in the Advocate's Book was the examples of where there's been success on land reform. Either it is in a joint venture approaches or some that is done purely by the state, because we cannot be all complete failures. There are some positive examples that I, for example, myself in agriculture, I have seen. I would have liked if the Advocate could have touched on some of those examples and perhaps lift them up and see how should those examples be replicated as we go forward. But overall, I think the book does us great service, and I will close by congratulating the Advocate again on the work done in this book. Thank you, Chair.
So sorry about that. We seemed to have a technical issue on our side. Thank you so much, Comrade Wandile. That was definitely an informative account of your conceptualization of the book. Without preempting the discussion or guiding where the discussion must go, I will not comment any further, but rather what we'll do now is go into discussions and Q&A. So what I'll do is open up the floor for engagements. So our participants can raise their hands. I will note 5 people at a time. We'll see how long this round is, and if we have enough time, then we'll go into another one. So please raise your hand so I'm able to note you. You can address your questions or comments to the panel, our book reviewers, or even to the Advocate himself. Comrade Limako, I have noted you. I think it says Limako. Comrade Zweli M, you'll be number 2. Comrade Joyce, I see you'll be number 3. And then is there anyone else? I'm not seeing any more hands. I don't know if it's, let's see. Alex Shoba, you'll be number 4. And then Comrade Mashudu, you'll be number 5. So in that order, Comrade Limako, you can begin.
No, thank you, Comrade, for giving me this opportunity to just to comment and make some inputs. And thanks for the work done by Advocate. It is so interesting to see how this land reform has just been a challenge to the country. And I think he mentioned very important thing that if we want to see it succeeding is by having a capable state to implement these important decisions that has been taken over and over by the conferences. But the question remains that where around the world, where we have seen this land reform being a success, so that we can tap from that. But one thing that is worrying is that the comfortability of the leadership that are not pursuing this land reform, because most of the leaders now, you find that they have farms, they have their own business. So most of the people who are struggling are the poor. So no one is doing nothing except this, what the resolutions that are taken by conference without implementation. So where around the world we have seen this being a success, and what we can do, because I don't see that we have a capable state who are struggling as the ruling party to be at that level. So the issue of land is very worrying, and it needs us not just to talk and talk all the time through the conferences, but to implement what will be the best for the poor, because the gap between the poor and the rich is still widening while we are talking and doing nothing. Thank you. But this is very good work that we can build from this book by Advocate. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Comrade Limako. Next was number 2, Comrade Zweli, if I'm not mistaken. Comrade Zweli, you are still muted. So if you could please unmute your mic.
Yeah,
thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Let me take this opportunity to thank Comrade Tembeka on giving us his thought and this research on land matters. This is very much important. But one other thing that I want to ask him about is the question of capacity. And I think the first speaker has alluded on it. The overwhelming officials who are dealing with the question of land. And in your book, Advocating Tembeka, you're talking about ANC after 94, when it took over, it was not yet ready. That is why they had only a policy of ready to govern, and which was not showing up that this is ANC's readiness. I mean, it's ready to govern. That is why we've seen a slow pace of a land reform. Do you think even now ANC is still not ready to deal with this mammoth task of land reform? And number 2, what mistakes can we avoid from learning from Zimbabwe, what the ZANU-PF has undergone? Do you think the problems of Zimbabwe are ZANU-PF based, or they are with the investors who decided to say that as long as Zimbabwe is taking a route of reclaiming back the land, therefore they will make it a point that they suffer economically? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Zweli. Just to advise the following speakers, please ensure that you keep your questions brief, concise, straight to the point, and then also directed to the actual panelists that you would like a response from. Thank you. Comrade Joyce, you're next, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. Mr. Chair, can you allow me to talk my language, Zulu, please?
No problem.
Yes, mine is not a question. In 1996, when Tawati Tiza was a minister, we claimed our land in Painville. Because I was born in Painville, we were removed in 1969 to Guatemala. We were the first to claim before Sophia Town. And then when we celebrate that we were born in 1998, because it was the closing date of, we celebrate at Sophia Town. And then many people in Guatemala, they did not claim because they did not trust this. They did not believe that it's going to happen. Only 350 that claim. And then 5 opt money, we opted the land. Then the government bought the land with 18,000. Then the person who was in charge there, he said, no, the government said the 15,000, then the 3,000 is going to be our 3,000. Ne? But mine is going to be long. If maybe sometimes if I can leave my numbers so that I can explain everything, because now there's a corruption in this, because houses were built, ne? But pensioners were robbed, because we still have a stand that were not built. Because when the Commissioner Mashiane leave, and then there was a commissioner, another commissioner said 2010, there's a corruption here. And then the person who's coordinating him must stop it, but he didn't stop it, because our houses were not plastered, were not nothing. Our money were taken to other advocate in town, in Springs. Were not plastered. We claim the subsidies. And then when the subsidies come, others they were plastered and everything. Others they did, others they did not get plastered. As long as plaster is in reserve. Then to our surprise, we found that there's a portion of land that is bought by in India. Our subsidies, when we check in our subsidies, they said we have withdrawn our subsidies, and the stand numbers are the stand numbers that are owned by that India in our land. So I don't know if I can leave my number so that I can explain everything, because this thing is very sensitive. Even the official was included in that corruptions. Corruptions.
Yes, no problem, Sis Joyce. What you can do for us is please send a message, a private message to Sipogazi Bolo, who is one of the participants. Just on your rights, check who the participants are, and then we'll be able to assist you. If you can't find her, then you can obviously just send a direct message to me. And thank you for that honest input in relation to your actual lived experience. I think what Comrade Joyce is showing us is the point that I'd raised earlier, that for as long as these formal institutions are not functional in terms of addressing the issue of land reform, then the systemic issue of trying to address the loss of land in terms of those who are disadvantaged by apartheid will remain an actual pipe dream. So this is an important discussion, and I'm glad that we have people who have actually direct lived experience of this. So I noted Comrade Alex to contribute to the discussion. Please ensure that you are brief, Comrade Alex. Thank you.
Thank you, Program Director. My name is Comrade Alex Shoba from Emakazin. What I would like to note, or first out, let me congratulate Comrade Tembeka on making sure the uvuselela conversation here, land reform and land restitution. What I see us as South Africans that we're running away from is the fact that we are still colonialized, and for that matter, we are facing challenges whereby when we talk about the land reform, you will see the American policymakers interfering into those issues. As the latter comrade mentioned, the issue as Zimbabwe, they are sanctioned as we speak because of that matter. It will be a program that fails specifically for that reason, so that we as Black people, we can be able to doubt ourselves to say, can we be able to implement this policy and make sure that it is successful? Unfortunately, I would also like to lobby, more especially the scholars, to say be able to assist our organization, the ANC, which is the only vehicle that can be able to assist us to make sure that we correct the mistakes of the past. I want to be brief. I don't want to continue. I have so much to say, but let us lobby all the scholars. As we see that we have AfriForum that is in line to make sure that they reverse all the gains that were gained from 1994 up until now. Let us all come together and make sure that we defend this, and we make sure that the land restitution and the land reform is a thing that can be able to work. If it needs to be fixed, yes, everything must be fixed. It's not that it's something that we know it will work 100% and for sure. But if we can be true to the call that was done by our forebearers, then whatever mistake or whatever obstacles that we come across, we will be able to overcome and be able to make sure that we attain the goal that we want to gain as Africans and Blacks in particular. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Comrade Alex Shoba. I think you're the last person I had noted. If not, then we'll just come back to the next one in the next round. Advocate Tembeka, there were a number of questions or commentary that was directed at you. So I'll allow you to please go first. And then the other panelists can then come in terms of where they feel that they'll need to cover. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the reactions from Unolundi Ngcukaito Wandile. Nolundi, your reflection was absolutely powerful. I sort of felt it, and I usually regard myself as someone who uses rationality, but your response was also felt so as well. I mean, I think that I'm not sure about the land reform fund. I mean, of course, if you have some money and you put it, that's usually a good idea. But I think what I'm trying to look into is a broader discussion on reparations. I think that's what South Africa needs. I mean, there is no country in the world that has sustained these levels of deprivation and loss, cultural, political, intellectual, even economical. You combine all of these losses, and then you think we can just recover, on our own, particularly with the persisting structural inequality that's going alongside this project of recovery. So yes, so Nolund is right. I am trying to talk meaningfully about reparations. And I think that we cannot have a conversation about land without putting it alongside reparations. So I was trying to expand the discussion about what was lost. And so one of the things I've tried to do is to look at race, that race is a construct, but not only to make the claim that it is a construct, but also to look at the phases in which that construct was developed. From race as biology, race as politics, but then race as the economy, and particularly how race as the economy then applies to the land reform project. So again, even on the cultural dimensions of dispossession, I tried again to look at how African ways of being have over time simply systematically been eroded. So that today, for instance, the whole conversation is happening in English, but it is among Africans. I didn't see any white people here, but even if they are, the majority of us here are all Africans, but we feel that the language to communicate is English. It's a practical thing. So in a sense, that's where sort of colonialism becomes common sense. It feels like common sense to speak English. but it's exactly the product of what I'm trying to examine about how successful the project has been. So you can't think meaningfully about land reform if you only look at it in an isolated way as an economic asset without looking at it broadly as, a way of being, and that's why this is not a book towards a goal, it's a book about ways of being. So land reform is in many ways a symbol of being, and so that's what I'm trying to say. That's why so if you have a land reform fund, that's fine, but the land reform fund will, just be like any other fund, like the TRC fund, etc. I do have a story of success, actually. It's at page 164. It's most fascinating because this is not a story based on what the government did. It's the women in the Eastern Cape who, on their own from Tsendane, and they set up their own cooperative, and they spoke to the private sector, to All Mutual, to Investec. And what they did, actually, they, in a sense, did things that we think when you're thinking about land reform, counterintuitive. By using communal land and using cattle as collateral. And ultimately, I think by the time I wrote, the project had started making profits in 2016. And there were something like 34 villages that were participating in that initiative. And I got to that story when I was trying to explore the situation of the people of Marikana. How did those strikers in 2012 sustain themselves during the no work, no pay period? I think it was something like 6 weeks. I found some evidence that actually some of the money was sent from the Eastern Cape to Johannesburg, which in a sense conflicts with our expectation that the money will move from Johannesburg. That's our understanding of remittances from Johannesburg to the Eastern Cape. And how did this happen? And I came through this incredible story of success, of bottom up. And that's the example I use there to show that even though the state is watching and constantly thinking about how are we going to help these people, what's the song, the 1985 Aretha Franklin song, sisters are doing it for themselves, and they truly are. So that's the most powerful story that I came across, which was worth putting into the book. It's a story without the state, but it's a story that appends the assumptions of a formal land reform program. And the only other thing I can I've spoken about capacity, and I don't think I want to go back to that. But the only thing I just wanted to talk about is the ZANU-PF story. Again, I have spoken about the ZANU-PF in the book at the beginning and towards the end of the book. I tried to weave together those experiences. There were two problems with Zimbabwe. The first problem was the destruction of the rule of law. And that destruction of the rule of law was a deliberate political program. Which was not caused so much by land, but it was caused by the potential for loss of political power by ZANU in 2000 when it lost the referendum. Because I looked at the constitutional amendments of 2000, and I looked specifically at the land section, and I realized that that land section as proposed by ZANU was basically similar to the Lancaster Constitution, and so there was no change. The more radical solution actually came from the MDC. But as soon as the ZANU-PF saw that there was a possibility for loss of political power, it then changed. And I looked also at the current Zimbabwean constitution, which is somehow paraded, as a model to follow. I think Nolunde calls this myth busting, but that's also another myth that the ZANU-PF model is something for us to aspire towards and follow. Specifically on the issue of expropriation without compensation. So if you ask people, what is the model? They say, well, look at Zimbabwe. But actually that's not true, because if you look at the Zimbabwean constitution, its definition of land is so narrow because it excludes agricultural land, it excludes product and all of those things. So in other words, it's just a barren piece of land that can be taken without compensation. Anything that grows on the land has to be paid for at market value. You know, a house that is on a piece of ground has to be paid for at market value. And the problem is that most recently in Zimbabwe, there has been a complete reversal of any of the land that was occupied during the war veterans land occupation project. It's been reverted back to the white farmers. And of course, if there is a country in this world with the perfect illustration of elite capture, it's been Zimbabwe. It's really the political elites in that country swept up most of the productive land for themselves. So I'm afraid to say that although Zimbabwe is a very tempting example, I'm afraid I think it is a very unpromising one from a South African perspective. So I think those are the only three things to say. There are a number of questions, but I should leave it there for now. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, advocates. Comrade Nolundi, you may proceed. And then right after we'll have Wandile Sihlobo.
Thanks, Madam Chair. In the interest of time, I'm going to be brief. I'm just going to respond to two questions. They're both in the chat. The one is from Uvu Sisbia from Evakastrom in Mpumalanga, who's asking if the ESTA Act is still functional. Vusi, the short answer is yes, ESTA is still in force. There's also then an earlier question from Biggs Mfuyua, forgive my pronunciation, Biggs, asking about why is there such an appetite to formalize land rights in rural areas. And, you know, I'd say that obviously in the book with Tembeka speaks to this as well, right? The kind of push towards formality and why that is and what underpins that. In short, I think that, you know, part of what we're seeing as a pattern emerging is around the discovering of minerals in many of these kind of former homeland rural areas. And of course, one wonders whether there is a connection between this push towards formalizing the land rights of rural communities and finding means and forms for accessing the kinds of minerals that are vested beneath the surface. And of course, you know, we know that formalizing patterns and programs of trying to formalize land rights have been proven to be highly problematic, both for, you know, family rights, as Tembeka very clearly explores in the book, what it means for people who hold what are considered to be secondary rights, the spouse, the wife, what happens when you formalize and whose interests end up getting entrenched. So for Biggs's question, I would really recommend that you engage with the book because it does speak to those elements. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Comrade Wandile. You may proceed.
Chair, I think let's take other hands that are up because I think on all of the points that have been raised, I think Sister Luli and Ruchola have covered them sufficiently. Let's take, I see you have over 8 hands that are up.
No problem. Just in the interest of time, I'll take only 4 hands. I do think that we'll definitely keep the conversation going outside of this platform, so comrades must not be discouraged. I see Comrade Ngcukaito, your hand has been up, so you'll go first. Comrade Minim Zamo, you will go second. Then Dr. Makumo Danny, you'll go third. And then lastly, we'll have Comrade Bongani Sidu. Reminder to please keep your engagements brief and straight to the point, and also indicate who you're directing the question to. Thank you so much. Comrade Ngcukaito, you can begin. Comrade Ngcukaito, are you able to hear us? Okay, I think let's move on to the next person. Comrade Minim Zamo, you are next. And then I'll note one last person to make it 4. Comrade Mzamo. Comrades, unmute your mics, maybe. Host, can you please unmute the participants' mics? Because it seems like there's an issue. Comrade Ngcukaito saying The mic is not unmuted, but Comrade Dr. Mukomo Danny, you can go ahead while we try sort that out. Okay, that is strange. Are comrades able to hear me on my side? Oh, okay. So it's the other speakers. Can we then have Comrade Sean Mavundla to, oh, you can't unmute. Comrade Sipogazi, can you please assist with the process of unmuting? Comrades are
Okay. Sorry, Chairperson, I'm the one who's hosting now. I'm trying to unmute them. I'm asking them to unmute, but they're not really unmuting as well. I don't know what's wrong.
Okay, comrades, when you want to speak, there will be a dialogue that pops up on your screen that says the host is asking you to unmute. You need to accept that, then you'll be able to speak. Because if you don't, then you're still going to be muted. So let's try that again. Comrade Sizagele, can you please then unmute Comrade Ngcukaito, who will begin? Comrade Ngcukaito, are you able to contribute to the discussion? Sure.
No, I'm trying to unmute her and nothing is happening. Okay.
No, so it could be from your side. Can you try someone else? Can you maybe try Dr. Makumo Danny?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I think finally I'm unmuted. Am I audible to everyone?
Yes, you are. You can proceed.
Thank you. Mine will basically be two brief questions, one to the advocate and one to Wandile as well. I think to the advocate, look, I agree with you that as a country we failed on the issue of land reform, but there's another issue of accountability that one needs to engage on. What then happens to our assembly and our legislators and politicians that have been put in state capacity to ensure that land reform goes well? Land is basically reformed and restituted to the rightful owners. What then happens to them? Because we're talking of 3 decades after. Is there any way of holding them accountable? Is there any way that we can make sure that there is justice? Because I think what we're doing now is a secondary abuse. Apart from the apartheid system having had abused Black South Africans, now what we're having is a state that has been deliberately weakened, and we're having legislators that can do something about it, but they've not been doing anything about it. The second one is that I think that we also need to take a much more concise approach to what does it actually mean to restore the dignity of Africans who have been moved from their land, because it's not just about the peri-urban, the agricultural and all those sorts of things. I mean, we're living in rural areas where we know communities whose graveyards are still stuck in farms, and they can't do anything to access that land. We know communities that have been moved to very unbarren land that they can't do anything on. So it perpetuates the inequality and poverty, which means that it is actually trampling on their human rights. I think this is much more of a very serious issue. And we are the most unequal nation in the world. And one of the biggest instruments that we can use is actually to make sure that there's a good land reform. So how do we then move through that? So we've seen the policies. I look more at the government. It's not just about ANC policies and the policy conference. In between policy conference, there's a mandate that is given to the state. Why are they not executing? Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Can we please have Ngcukaito, who will follow? Are you unmuted now?
Yes, I'm unmuted. My name is Ngcukaito from the University of Pretoria. My question is directed to Advocate Ngcukaito. Do you think that Section 25 of the Constitution is inadequate in its ways to approach land reform? Or do you think the Land Claims Court is the one that is poorly equipped to take on the land reform process? My second question is that scholars call for the defining of democracy in an African vernacular. do you think that some of the first Black lawyers in South Africa have paved a way in our way of how we understand democracy? And in such cases of land reform, do you think Africans in the diaspora have the right to contribute to matters of land reform and decolonization? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Comrade Ngcukaito. I'd noted Comrade Sean Mavundla. Comrade Sean. I see your mic is unmuted, but you aren't speaking.
Hello, can you hear me, Chair?
Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you very much for this wonderful opportunity. I would also like to say thank you very much to Advocate Tembeka for such an interesting and timely book. It is very crucial, especially in the times that we're actually living in. So I just have two quick questions. One, it's for Nolundi, and then one for Advocate Tembeka. I think Nolundi, in her introductory remarks, she talked about how Advocate Tembeka did a brilliant job in actually capturing the feelings of the people in terms of the land dispossession violently that actually happened in this country, and how people are now sort of in a way profoundly and powerfully feeling deeply betrayed by this government. So I just wanted to know from her, looking at the sentiments of the people on the ground, notwithstanding the rhetoric that we get from Luthuli House and all of these things, when we look at the people on the ground, what do you think we actually stand to lose as a country, considering how just yesterday we were talking about Freedom Day, but still people have not tasted that fruit of freedom. People don't have land. They're basically struggling to make ends meet. So what does this continued land dispossession do to the spirit of these people and to the spirit of our country? And just quickly to Advocate Tembeka, I think a while back, there was an announcement from the minister, Togo Didiza, about how 700,000 hectares of land will be released and people can apply so that such vacant land can be utilized by the people. So I just wanted to know from him, do you have any knowledge in terms of how the process has been unfolding, how much hectares has been released and to who? Thank you very much once again for this opportunity, Chair.
Thank you, Comrade Sean. Comrades, just in the interest of time, unfortunately, those are the only engagements I'll be able to take in this round. So Advocate Tembeka, if you could please respond to the questions directed at you, and then also the other panelists in terms of questions that are directed at them. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I think I've noted only two.
Yes.
The first one is around accountability. I mean, I agree that there should be accountability. I mean, my function is to try and outline the problem and its genesis. I think the only thing I would add on this point, I mean, it's true that we must hold the people we've elected accountable, but I think that it is short-sighted to examine, quote unquote, the failure in the last 28 years or something. We've got to look at how deep the dispossession is, and we have to look at 400 years of dispossession, systematic dispossession, wave after wave of dispossession. And again, I will repeat this point. There are no countries in the world that can overcome the systemic dispossession of the ways of being without reparations. And that is what South Africa has been expected to be like. Been expected since 1994, as Wandile pointed out, to just get on with it. So unless you have a meaningful discussion about a reparative perhaps restorative project, which takes into account the depth of the loss. It's not easy to talk, sort of glibly about, if only I got a piece of land, things will be fine, because they are not fine, and they won't be fine. So that is, I think, a structural fault line in our imagination of the past and the future. It's the fact that there is still something missing in the South African discourse. Even if, I've had many experiences on this land issue. Even if you sit as a judge of the Land Claims Court and you award the family a piece of land, say, well, this is now your land, and it was taken from you in 1960, you can go back, District 6, whatever. There is still a grievance. The mere fact that you have reconnected people to a piece of ground is insufficient. There's still a grievance. There's still a sense in which whites have not accounted for the past. Whites have not paid for the crime of apartheid. And there's still that ongoing grievance. And I have tried to examine this by reference to the writings of Professor Tjenas Roux, who speaks of the comparison between the TRC model and the land reform model, and says that one of the reasons why the TRC at least had some therapeutic possibility, even if it was an incomplete therapeutic possibility, at least it was there, was that victims and perpetrators came face to face. You could see your torturer, and you could talk to him, and you could extract some truth, even if it was incomplete. But with the land reform program, it was completely excluded from that confrontation of the victim and the dispossessor. And in between, the structure that was imposed was the state. And there was never a moment of that negotiation, that direct conversation, because the state then became the agent for the resolution of all land dispossession. So that sense of land injustice and the failure of the whites to account for the land injustice always feels like it's constantly present in the conversation about land. And that's why I come back to this example. Whenever I've been with a family or a person who has received a piece of ground that was taken, you would expect that they will feel a sense of justice. But instead, that sense of justice is always tempered with a sense of grievance. So something else is missing in our imagination of ourselves. And that's part of the work I try to bring out, that there is a restorative, reparative project that we are not talking about, that we should be talking about. We look at this in pure transactional, utilitarian lenses. And that transactional, utilitarian lenses is depriving us of the ability to have a broader conversation. So that's what I was trying to say there around this issue. I remember this issue about Minister Didiza announcing this, and I wrote about it in the Business Day. What I saw about these 700,000 hectares is that they were being advertised and that people could apply. But there's a very serious problem with that system of advertising and applications, because it's a very opaque system. Nobody actually knows where these hectares are. I'll give you one example of something I personally investigated. I went down to the Eastern Cape because I wanted to know in the Eastern Cape where these pieces of the 700,000 hectares will be. And one of the complaints I received when I was there from the officials at the Commission and the Land Affairs Department was that some of this land already has occupants. So because the way this was designed, it was all designed on paper. It was not designed based on actual scientific research. So they would advertise a farm for lease, but that farm has been occupied since 1994, and it has people, and those people already have a lease agreement with the government. So that's the point I wrote about in the Business Day, and I said that it's actually reflective of the larger malaise with the land reform. Even an intervention like this that looks good on paper is immediately bedeviled by lack of research. Yes, thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Advocate Tembeka. Comrade Nolundi, there was a question that was directed at you. If you could please respond.
Yes, there was, Chair. Very briefly to Sean, I think what we stand to lose, Sean, is an opportunity to begin the process of generational healing. I think that for as long as we don't resolve these questions related to land, as long as we don't develop a workable model for land reform, we're locking another generation into these same static, difficult, unhealed debates, questions. And I think that that's an opportunity we'd miss. I also think that if we don't seriously begin to address the land reform question, we also miss an opportunity to make shifts and strides for women, which I optimistically perhaps believe could really make changes to the position of some women within their communities. So in a very brief nutshell, I think that there are gendered advances that we could be making, and I think that we would miss the opportunity for generational healing. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Comrade Wandile. Closing remark from you, please.
Yeah, the closing remark, Chair, I would link with the brief point that was raised by Dr. Denny. And Dr. Denny, on the accountability and delivery, I think that's the point that also comes out on the advocate's book. The issues of capacity, corruption do to an extent contribute to some of the difficulties that we are in. And I think the capacity story links also to the point that the advocate was making, the fact that we don't have a good grasp of what's where. The 700,000 hectares that was talking about, you found that there were already some people that were there, expectations were also already raised in society. So that, for me, it again speaks to that. So that there's a lot of work that needs to be done by those that are in government in improving their capacity, improving statistics, in all of these things. But I think for everyone that is in the call, for me, I mean, I'll take this again to advertise for the advocate. This is important work. I think you should go and get it, especially now that we are in another cycle of elections where land is being talked about. I think it's a great service. Thanks again, Chair, and thanks to the advocate and Sis Nolundi.
Thank you so much, Comrade Wandile. We have reached the end of our discussion. I think for me, more than anything, the takeaway is that when we're looking at the issue of land reform, we need to ensure that we have an understanding that our citizens in our communities have different relationships in terms of their conceptualization with land, and a blanket approach won't assist in us trying to achieve land reform. So we need to look at land reform not just as a issue of pure ownership, but also that their people have a direct relationship with the land due to the labor that they've put in terms of working the land. And even with women, the unpaid labor that goes into the households in terms of aiding those who are doing putting in the direct effort in relation to land. Secondly, we also have there's a lot of missing issues in the discourse when we speak about land in South Africa. There needs to be an intentional approach to ensure that we have those who had been dispossessed and those who took the land in a direct engagement in order for there to be some sort of closure that's afforded to the dispossessed in our country. I would like to encourage everyone to purchase the book. As Comrade Wandile has said, the conversation does have to continue in your branches, in your communities. We can't only speak about land when it's election time, because we are trying to address a structural and a systemic issue. So we do hope that our comrades will actually take the discussion further and ensure that there's continuity in the process on social media and in whatever spaces that you may find yourself in. The Tambo School of Leadership would also like to thank our participants, our panelists, who took part in the discussion, Advocate Tembeka, Comrade Nolundi, Comrade Wandile. We really did learn a lot from the robust engagement that took place. And most importantly, we'd like to thank everybody who joined us through the various platforms at home. We do hope that it was beneficial, and we do hope that the battle of ideas will continue in whatever corner that you find yourselves in. We'd like to also make it known that please look out for more information regarding our next book review. I did say that we will host 4 of these in a year, and this was our first one. So thank you very much to everyone for joining. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I would love
Have a good
to
evening
read
to
my
everyone.
number.
Thank you, everyone.
Chair.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.